Welcome to Scones and Coffee. We've discussed in the last few videos cookies, pancakes, and other thin batter foods, as well as bread. Scones will have a similar chemistry to these items that we've already discussed, and so we're going to discuss them only very briefly. Instead, we're going to focus on the chemistry of coffee and the other commonly brewed drink, tea. We'll also discuss in a little bit more detail about how we experience the flavors and aromas of the food and drink that we consume. The term biscuit comes from the French word meaning twice cooked. Similarly, the Italian biscotti are hard cookies that are baked into loaves, then cut crosswise into thin pieces and baked again at a low temperature until they're dry. That is, they're baked twice. In England, the term biscuits refers to what we Americans would call cookies. So the tea and biscuits that the English are famous for is a snack of a few cookies paired with a hot tea. Now, what we Americans call biscuits contain little to no sugar and often no eggs. They're made from milk or buttermilk, flour, a solid fat such as shortening or butter, and baking soda. They're cooked only briefly until they're soft and tender. Now, from now on, when I use the term biscuit, I'm referring to the American definition of a biscuit. We have two main types of biscuits: a crusty, irregular top with a tender interior, and a flat top with a flaky interior. The biscuits with a crusty, irregular top are made with minimal handling to minimize the gluten development. That is, if we overmix the dough, we'll essentially be kneading it and developing the gluten network like we saw with breads. Since we want a tender biscuit, we want to avoid this strengthening of the gluten network. The second type of biscuit with a flaky interior is made with just enough folding and kneading to create a structure of alternating thin layers of dough and fat. As we saw in the last video, when we were discussing pastries, this alternating series of layers can be accomplished by rolling out the dough with a layer of butter on top. We then fold the two layers over and roll them back out to the original size. As we repeat this fold and roll procedure, we create more and more layers that are thinner and thinner. The layers of protein and starch are separated by the layers of fat, and so they separate easily in the same way that we can easily separate pieces of paper from a stack. Within a single sheet of paper or a single sheet of dough, there are lots of chemical bonds keeping the individual layer together. But between different sheets of paper or layers of dough, there are very few bonds holding the separate pages or layers near one another, and so they separate relatively easily. Both of these types of biscuits will have a strong flavor of flour due to the relatively simple ingredients, the short cooking time, and the use of chemical rather than biological leavening. An American scone is often more of a dessert-like pastry, as the one shown here drizzled with icing. On the other hand, an English scone is similar in composition and taste to the American biscuit, so it's much less sweet. The recipe for scones we'll make this week is an English scone, so it's more like a biscuit than a pastry. Okay, let's switch gears here and talk about the various flavorings we get from plants. Some of the flavors come from the major ingredients we add to dishes in the form of fruits and vegetables, such as tomatoes, chilies, peaches, apples, and so on, while other flavors are from minor ingredients that contain lots of flavor, such as herbs and spices. So what's the difference between an herb and a spice? Herbs are plant leaves, either used fresh or dried for later use. Spices are basically any other portion of the plant, such as the dry seed, bark, or root. We've discussed flavor in the past, but let's review. The sensation of flavor is a combination of the sensations of taste and smell. That is, we combine the signals we get from the taste buds in our mouths with the signals we get from the odor receptors in our noses. Both types of receptors are nerves that respond to specific chemical inputs. That is, they respond only when specific chemicals or classes of chemical bind to that nerve ending. We have 5 different types of taste buds: sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and savory, also called umami. Sweet receptors bind to sugars, typically the small mono and disaccharides. Sour receptors bind to acids. Salty receptors bind to salts, which would usually be sodium chloride, but they can bind to other salts. Bitter receptors bind to bases such as phenols and tannins. And savory or umami receptors bind to amino acids. One particular amino acid, glutamic acid, or its alkaline form, glutamate, binds particularly strongly to the umami receptor. So foods that contain this amino acid taste particularly savory to us. Such foods include meats, meat broth, many fermented products, soy sauce, or foods containing added monosodium glutamate, or MSG. However, where we only have 5 types of taste receptors, humans have roughly 400 different types of scent receptors. With these scent receptors, we can detect and differentiate between a trillion different odors. In order for us to taste a food, such as an apple, molecules in the apple need to come in contact with the taste buds on our tongues. This happens naturally when we eat the apple. But for us to experience the apple's odor, molecules from the apple need to make their way into our noses. Of course, we're not shoving the apple up our nose, so there must be another way that those molecules get to our odor receptors. When we chew the apple, the volatile chemicals in the apple leave the solid or liquid phases and enter the air trapped inside our mouth. Some of this air then moves up a tube between the back of our throat and our nasal cavity. The volatile chemicals that travel with this small amount of air then bind to the odor receptors and we can detect the apple's odor. Now, our taste receptors mainly detect the apple's sugar, but there will also be some acid, although how much will depend strongly on what type of apple that we've eaten. However, that's really all the information our mouth can give. The information distinguishing an apple from, say, a peach is coming from the odor receptors in our nose. Unfortunately, when you get sick, sometimes the inflammation can block your nasal passages from your mouth, preventing the volatile chemicals from making it up to your odor receptors. This is why the flavor of your food often suffers when you get a cold or other upper respiratory infection. Now, as I'm making this video in the summer of 2020, the coronavirus that causes COVID-19 is spreading rapidly throughout the United States. One of the common symptoms is an almost total lack of smell. This is likely caused by the inflammation of those nasal passages, preventing volatile chemicals from making it to the odor receptors, and therefore the odor receptors have nothing to bind to. Remember that at heart, humans are animals, and animals use their sense of smell for finding out lots of information about their surroundings, such as about the air, the ground, nearby plants, other animals, predators, prey, and mates. Humans use our sense of smell for all of these things too, including for finding mates. Studies have shown that we give off certain pheromones signaling to potential mates that our bodies have certain genes that may confer an evolutionary advantage under certain circumstances. Our potential mates respond positively or negatively to these pheromones depending upon a variety of factors, such as whether those traits might improve the survival chances of any potential offspring. So how does the sensation of odor make it to our brains? As we've seen, volatile chemicals bind to the odor receptors in our nasal passages. Those odor receptors are nerve cells and send electrical impulses up into the olfactory bulb in our brain. Note that in the image I've shown here, the front of the head is on the left, where the eye sockets would be just below the olfactory bulb, and the back of the head is on the right, where you can see the spinal cord running down from the base of the brain. The olfactory bulb serves to filter the signals coming from the odor receptors. Your nose is constantly sending your brain a ton of information about what it smells. But not all of that information is useful. In fact, very little of it will be useful for making decisions, and so the olfactory bulb filters out much of it before sending it on to the amygdala. For example, when you first walk into a room, you might notice a pleasant aroma of an air freshener. But once you've been in the room for a few minutes, the aroma seems to fade and you're no longer consciously aware of it. Those aromatic molecules are still binding to your odor receptors, but your olfactory bulb is removing it from your conscious experience. But if you leave the room for a few minutes and then come back, your olfactory bulb registers the aroma as new again, and then you become consciously aware of the aroma. The amygdala is responsible for a few tasks, such as our memory, decision-making, and emotional reactions. It's situated quite close to the hippocampus, which serves to turn short-term memories into long-term memories. Naturally, the brain is quite complex, and so I'm glossing over quite a few details here. Our sense of smell is somewhat unique compared to our other senses due to how and where the information enters our brain. Because the signal from the olfactory bulb goes straight to the amygdala, the emotion center, smells are particularly evocative of memories of particular places and events, especially from our childhoods. For example, the smell of freshly cut grass, or the beach, or just after a rainstorm usually evoke a strong reaction in us as they remind us of such a specific set of circumstances. Likewise, the smell of a library full of books is quite distinctive and originates from the volatile products released as microbes slowly break down the pages in those books. Remember that our human ancestors were omnivores. That is, they ate anything of nutritional value that they could find on the African savanna, including scraps of meat, nuts, fruits, leaves, tubers, and so on. They used their senses of smell and taste to identify edible and inedible objects. Things that tasted sweet meant lots of high-calorie sugars and would therefore be eaten. Things that tasted bitter meant that they contained lots of toxic alkaloids, that is, bases, and would be avoided. Things that smelled foul meant rotten flesh that would be dangerous to eat. Each of these tastes or aromas gives us useful information in determining whether or not we should seek it out or avoid it to increase our chances of survival. And so we evolved strong instinctual reactions to these types of experiences. Our ancestors ate a broad diet composed of a few hundred different types of foods. This meant that they had lots of different flavors and odors to keep track of. It also provided a rich variety of flavors, and so today's meal was always different from yesterday's meal. But as we developed agriculture somewhere around 10,000 years ago, we traded this varied but risky diet for a more predictable but much more monotonous one. We largely lived on a few crops such as wheat, barley, rice, and corn. These grains all have plenty of energy and protein and so could keep us alive, but they have relatively few flavorful compounds. So to try to strike a balance between the safety of these new crops and the rich variety of the past, we began to add small bits of other, more flavorful plants. That is, we started using herbs and spices to flavor our food. Remember that most of the flavorful compounds in herbs and spices are chemical weapons for the plant that evolved to keep animals from eating that portion of the plant. In large quantities, such as eating a dish composed only of that plant, they are so unpleasant that they successfully keep us from eating that plant. For example, eating a tablespoon of cinnamon. The flavor is so strong that you gag and choke on it. Although in the case of cinnamon, the dryness of that powdered cinnamon doesn't particularly help things either. However, if we add just a small quantity of the spice to a dish, the flavor is diluted sufficiently that there's enough flavor to keep us interested without being overpowering. At their heart, both tea and coffee fall into this category of herbs and spices. Tea is made from a dried leaf, so it could be considered an herb, while coffee is made from a roasted seed, so it could be considered a spice. The flavorful compounds in tea and coffee are chemical defenses that humans have learned to dilute with water and modify to turn the resulting broth into drinks that we love, or at least are significantly more palatable than the raw leaf or bean. One of these defensive chemicals common to both tea leaves and coffee beans is caffeine, shown here on the right. Caffeine is a bitter alkaloid that significantly alters the chemistry of our bodies in a wide variety of different ways. In addition to caffeine, however, both tea and coffee also contain large amounts of astringent phenolic compounds. Remember that these astringent compounds will make your mouth feel dry, similar to eating an unripe banana. Now, while tea and coffee have some similarities, they arise from different plants and different processes that we perform with those plants. To make tea, we take the actively growing leaves from the tea plant. Those young, actively growing leaves are rich in a wide variety of different enzymes, whereas a mature, that is no longer growing, leaf will be lacking in those enzymes. After being picked off the plant, those leaves are dried with a minimum of heat. We then let those leaves steep in hot water to allow many of the compounds in the leaf to dissolve into the water. To make coffee, the coffee beans, that is the seeds, are harvested and then roasted. The roasting process serves to develop many flavorful compounds via chemical reactions between the wide variety of different compounds in the beans. After being roasted, the beans are ground, then hot water is again used to dissolve many of the compounds in the grounds. Again, with both coffee and tea, we dissolve a fair amount of caffeine into the water. As a result, caffeine is the most widely consumed drug in the world. Now, I mentioned earlier that caffeine causes a number of significant changes to our body chemistry. This is because it interferes with a particular signaling system used by many different cells in our bodies, and thus it has many different effects upon our bodies. The effect that we most associate with caffeine, however, is that it stimulates the central nervous system, relieving drowsiness and fatigue, and lowering reaction times at least to some extent. However, caffeine also has a wide variety of other effects upon our bodies. One is that it increases the production of energy in muscles as it increases our metabolism to a small degree. Some scientific studies indicate that consumption of caffeine may increase our mood and mental performance. However, more recent scientific studies suggest that these improvements are largely the result of removing caffeine withdrawal from habitual caffeine consumers. That is, when your body is used to a certain amount of caffeine and you stop consuming it, you undergo withdrawal symptoms causing temporary moodiness and cognitive decline. We'll get into exactly why this occurs in a bit. But then, when exposed to caffeine again, the removal of these negative impacts of the caffeine withdrawal returns the body to normal. So it's probably less that caffeine improves performance rather than the caffeine withdrawal decreases it. Other impacts of caffeine include an increased heart rate, and at high doses can cause abnormal heart rates in addition to restlessness, nervousness, and insomnia, as the nervous system is so stimulated that it has a difficult time calming down. Additionally, caffeine appears to increase the loss of calcium from bone. Our bones grow in length until around 18 years old for women and 21 for men, but they continue getting denser until we reach peak bone mass typically between ages 25 and 30. However, after this point, we begin slowly losing bone mass. That is, calcium is slowly removed from our bones. And this process continues as we age, until we're at greater and greater risk of breaking a hip or other bone in a fall. This is particularly worrisome for women since they reach a lower peak bone mass than do men. But either way, if your family has a history of osteoporosis, you may wish to reduce or eliminate your intake of caffeine to reduce the risk of such injuries as you age. The amount of caffeine in your blood reaches a maximum between 15 minutes and 2 hours after drinking it. Now, the half-life of caffeine in the body is between 3 and 7 hours. The half-life is the time it takes your body to metabolize, that is, remove from the bloodstream, half of the caffeine. Let's assume a half-life of 5 hours. 5 hours after the peak caffeine level, you would have half of that peak level left. After 10 hours, it would be halved again to 1/4 of the peak value, and so on. So by the following morning, caffeine withdrawal symptoms will have set in. Those symptoms, if you don't consume any more caffeine, will last for about 3 days. Now, because caffeine affects a wide variety of different processes in your body, the withdrawal symptoms will also be widely varied. Symptoms include headache, sleepiness, irritability, lethargy, constipation, depression, muscle pain, stiffness, cramping, lack of concentration, flu-like symptoms such as stuffy nose, blocked sinuses and sinus pressure, insomnia, nausea and vomiting, anxiety, dizziness, and heart rhythm abnormalities. So how much caffeine is in coffee or tea? Coffee beans are 1 to 2% caffeine by mass, while tea leaves are slightly higher at 2 to 3%. However, a higher proportion of the coffee grounds are extracted as compared to the tea leaf, so coffee has 8 to 10 grams of coffee extract per cup, while tea has 2 to 5 grams of tea extract per cup. Note, however, that these masses are for all of the compounds extracted from the coffee grounds or tea leaves, not just the mass of caffeine. The end result, however, is that a typical cup of coffee contains more caffeine than the typical cup of tea, although this will depend upon how exactly each drink is prepared. What other impacts do coffee and tea have upon our health? I'm not a medical doctor, so nothing I say should be taken as medical advice. However, both coffee and tea have antioxidant compounds, while black and green teas also have phenolic compounds that appear to have some reduction in damage to arteries as well as reducing the risk of cancer. So it appears that coffee and tea can have some positive impacts along with the potential downsides of consuming caffeine. In the end, the best advice here is likely the same as the advice about most other food and drink. The consumption of coffee and tea is likely fine in moderation, but you should avoid consuming large quantities and maintain a reasonably varied diet, including in the drinks that you choose to consume. Now, since brewed tea and coffee are both 95 to 98% water, the water used to brew them will have a large effect upon the resulting drink. The chlorine used to disinfect most municipal tap water is driven off by the heat involved in boiling the water, so any taste associated with it will also be removed. However, hard waters containing high calcium and magnesium carbonates will slow the extraction of flavor, generally cloud the brew, clog espresso machines, and reduce the formation of espresso foam. On the other hand, soft water tends to over-extract the coffee or tea and gives a somewhat salty flavor. But you don't want to use pure water either, as distilled water extracts a brew that McGee describes as flat with a missing dimension of flavor. That is, the water from your tap contains a variety of chemicals dissolved in it, and those various chemicals generally improve the flavor of these drinks, at least if those chemicals are in moderate concentrations. Ideally, we want our brewing water to be moderate in mineral content, that is, not too hard but not too soft, and at a neutral pH. Starting with water of neutral pH, we'll end up with a brew with a pH of around 5, which will have a very slight sour taste. If you have alkaline water with a pH higher than 7, you can acidify it by adding some cream of tartar, which is tartaric acid, until you can just taste the sourness of the acid. For most of us, municipal tap water will be quite close to a pH of 7, and so this won't be a concern. But it can be an issue for those on well water, especially if the ground contains lots of limestone. The tea tree Camellia sinensis is native to Southeast Asia and southern China. If allowed to grow naturally, the plant will grow to roughly 3 meters tall, or about 10 feet. But the tea leaves are harvested by hand, so a tea tree cultivated for harvest will typically be pruned to be only about waist high. The young tea leaves that are plucked for our drink are packed with lots of defensive chemicals. Before recorded history, the tea leaves were likely chewed raw, similar to how tobacco is sometimes chewed today. Around 1 CE, the people in southwest China learned to use physical pressure, mild heat, and time to extract the flavors and colors from the tea leaf into water. By around 1000 CE, tea was a staple of the Chinese diet. By 200 CE, the leaves were boiled and then dried for later use. And by about 700 CE, the leaves were also stir-fried before drying. These techniques give a green or yellow-green tea with a relatively mild but bitter and astringent flavor. In the 1100s, Japanese Buddhist monks developed the formal tea ceremony, which has survived to today. By the 1600s, more strongly flavored orange-red teas similar to modern oolongs were developed. To make these stronger brews, the leaves are allowed to wilt or are pressed before being dried. This gives additional time for chemical reactions to develop a distinctive aroma and color in the leaves. It was around this time that China began to trade more extensively with Europe and Russia. This more complex style of tea became quite popular in England as well as many of the English colonies. Consumption rose from about 20,000 pounds in 1700 to about 20 million pounds in 1800. In the 1840s, the Chinese developed an even stronger so-called black tea for export to the West. This tea is the result of a very intensive pressing process, causing more damage to the leaves than the process for oolongs. This black tea is the most commonly consumed variety in Western society today. I've shown here an image comparing a variety of different types of tea leaves and the resulting brew. As we move from top to bottom, the leaves undergo additional pressing and chemical reactions that allow the development of flavors and the transformation of some of the less pleasant flavorful compounds into more pleasant ones. China and Japan still produce and drink more green tea than black tea, much the same as would have been common hundreds of years ago. Until the late 1800s, China was the only significant producer of tea. However, the Chinese began to resist the British practice of paying for tea with opium. This isn't terribly surprising, since the large quantities of the opioids flooding China were causing significant problems. However, rather than paying the Chinese in cash or some other valuable commodity, the British responded by moving tea production to their colonies, chiefly to India. As a result, even today, India is the major producer of tea, as the relatively cheap labor and favorable climate provide significant economic benefits, at least to the shareholders, if not for the workers themselves. The fresh tea leaf contains very abundant phenolic compounds. As with the other phenols we've discussed in the past, these phenols taste bitter and astringent, meaning that chewing on the raw leaf isn't a particularly pleasant experience. The other aroma and flavor compounds that will be later produced exist in non-volatile combinations with sugar molecules inside the green leaf. Now, due to the relatively simple processing, green tea retains many of the qualities of the raw leaf. However, the black tea popular in the West requires significant changes to the composition of those compounds in the leaf. To accomplish these changes, the leaf is pressed to crush the cells. This allows the defensive chemicals stored inside the cells out to mix with a variety of enzymes. Those enzymes are then given time to transform the defensive chemicals into much more pleasant flavors via two processes. The first is that sugar aroma complexes are separated, which causes the now much smaller aromatic molecules to be much more volatile, allowing them to enter the air. The second is that small, three-ring phenolic compounds are combined to form bigger molecules that are no longer bitter or astringent. This process is similar to the addition of milk to the cocoa powder we discussed in an earlier video, causing the astringent compounds in the cocoa to bind to the milk proteins, meaning that they no longer bind to the proteins in our saliva, and thereby reduce the astringency. For an oolong, we have transformed about half of these phenolic compounds into larger complexes, so the bitterness and astringency will be roughly half of what it is in green tea. And for black teas, we have transformed about 85% of the phenolic compounds, so the improvement in flavor will be even greater. Iced tea is the most consumed form of tea in the United States. The brewing process of this black tea is largely the same as for other teas, but to compensate for the dilution effect of melting ice, it's brewed stronger, with about 50% more tea leaves. Now, when we add ice to normally brewed tea, the tea turns cloudy. This cloudiness is due to the formation of particles of a complex between caffeine and theaflavin. These particles are harmless, but the negative impact upon the appearance of the drink means that in a commercially prepared iced tea, the manufacturer will either filter these precipitated particles out, or they'll add an ingredient that breaks up these complexes. Those of you from the South may have noticed that McGee makes no mention of sweet tea. This isn't terribly surprising since he's not from the South. However, the chemistry isn't substantially different except for the added sugar. Furthermore, I am also not originally from the South, so this is all I'm going to say about it too. Now let's switch from tea to coffee. The coffee tree is native to East Africa. The fruits are similar to cherries and contain the seeds, or beans, from which we brew coffee. The leaves of the tree were originally used to make a kind of tea. The drink of coffee brewed from the bean originated in 14th century Yemen when the beans were first roasted, ground, and brewed. The coffee tree was taken to India around 1600, and then from India to Java around 1700, and from Java to the French Caribbean shortly thereafter. Today, Brazil, Vietnam, and Colombia are the largest exporters of coffee. Despite being the continent on which coffee originated, Africa now accounts for only about 20% of the coffee produced worldwide. The original Arab version of coffee was made by combining the powdered beans, water, and sugar in an open pot. The mixture was heated until it boiled and foamed. The heat was then reduced to allow it to settle a little bit, and then boiled again a couple more times. Then the brew was decanted into small cups. However, the relatively high temperature and long brewing process means that Arab coffee is quite bitter. Furthermore, the coffee grounds are not filtered out or removed in any way other than by allowing gravity to slowly settle the sediment. This extended contact with the grounds means that the coffee needs to be consumed fairly quickly, or the bitterness continues to increase as additional extraction continues to occur. Around 1700, French cooks began to enclose the coffee grounds in a cloth bag. This primitive filtration produced a clearer, less gritty brew. It also allows the removal of the majority of the coffee grounds, and so more time can be taken to drink the coffee without having the bitterness continue to increase. And around 1750, the French created the drip pot to brew coffee. The drip pot makes three major improvements. First, it keeps the water temperature below boiling, which will reduce the extent of extraction of those bitter compounds. Second, it limits the time the water is in contact with the grounds, which prevents the over-extraction of those grounds. And third, it produces a brew with a relatively little sediment, and so once the brew is complete, the flavor changes much more slowly. Coffee brewed in a drip pot is substantially less bitter and astringent, which then allows the other flavorful compounds to become more prominent. That is, most people find coffee from a drip pot to be more pleasant than coffee brewed in the Arabian style. As the Industrial Revolution continued into the 19th century, a wide variety of new coffee makers were invented using a variety of different advancements in technology. The first was the percolating coffee pot shown here. Here, the grounds are placed into the basket that sits near the top of a central tube. When water in the pot begins to boil, the curved plate at the bottom caught the bubbles of steam, and a mixture of steam and hot, liquid water rose up through the tube. The water poured out the tube onto the top of the basket, then percolated through the grounds before finally rejoining the hot water below. Similar to the use of the cloth bag, this allowed the grounds to be kept separate from the brewed coffee, and the length of brewing could be controlled by removing the pot from the stove. However, as the brewed coffee simply rejoined the pool of water below, the compounds extracted from the grounds were subjected directly to the heat on the bottom of the pot. That is, the coffee tends to take on a burnt flavor. Additionally, this method of getting the water up the tube requires heating the water to boiling, which is hotter than the ideal brewing temperature. Next up, we have the plunger pot, in which the coffee grounds would be extracted directly into the hot water. Once the desired strength was achieved, the plunger would be pressed down, trapping the grounds at the bottom of the pot, and the brewed coffee could then be poured off. In theory, this type of coffee maker worked great. However, in practice, many of the grounds would make it past the plate at the bottom of the plunger and continue extraction once poured out of the pot. It did, however, allow the heating of the water below the boiling point, so greater control of the extraction could still be had. With additional advances in metalworking and machinery came the espresso machine. Here, water is forced through the coffee grounds at high pressures. The high pressure extracts much more of the bean's oil and emulsifies it into very tiny droplets with a particularly velvety texture. This much higher extraction causes espresso to be particularly strong compared to the other brewing methods, and the addition of the oils causes the formation of a foam that's lacking from those other brewing methods. Let's now turn to the roasting process. The raw, green coffee beans are hard, similar to unpopped popcorn. And just like unpopped popcorn, that tough outer coating isn't particularly tasty. When we roast the beans, they soften and develop much of the flavor via Maillard reactions, that is, browning reactions, as well as a variety of other chemical reactions. To roast the beans, we heat them to between 370 and 425 degrees Fahrenheit for between 90 seconds and 15 minutes, depending upon the sort of flavor we want in the eventual brew. As the bean temperature gets to the boiling point of water, the water turns to steam and the bean puffs up, and the volume grows by about 50%. Again, this is a similar puffing up that occurs in popcorn as the water boils. However, in the popcorn, the outer seed coat fractures open and the starchy interior quickly expands into a light, spongy texture. With the coffee bean, they don't have that violent fracturing of the seed coat that occurs in popcorn, but the volume expansion occurs in a similar manner. As the temperature rises, the proteins, sugars, phenolic compounds, and a variety of other molecules break down into smaller, more reactive fragments that react with one another. This wide array of reactions develops the dark brown pigments and roasted aromas of the Maillard reactions we've discussed before. At around 320 degrees Fahrenheit, these reactions become self-sustaining. That is, the energy released by these reactions is enough to keep the temperature of the beans from dropping, even if we stop heating them. The reactions continue to produce steam and carbon dioxide. As the roasting continues, oil begins escaping from the damaged cells in the bean and rises up to the surface, causing the bean surface to take on a shiny appearance. Now, because those reactions are self-sustaining, we need to forcibly cool the beans to stop that roasting process once the beans reach the level that we desire. That is, we need to quench the beans using cold air or water. At this point, the beans are brown and relatively brittle. They're also sponge-like as they puffed up and the carbon dioxide fills those spongy holes. Naturally, the hotter and longer we allow the beans to get while roasting them, the darker the color they develop. In the early stages of roasting, the sugars are broken down into a variety of acids such as formic acid, acetic acid, that is vinegar, and lactic acid. The products of these reactions give the beans a light brown color, and the acids provide a tartness. If we continue to roast at higher temperatures, the acids and astringent phenolic compounds decompose. As a result, the acidity and astringency decrease, but in their place the bitterness increases as the browning reactions continue. For very darkly roasted beans, the acids, tannins, and soluble carbohydrates, that is, the sugars, decline. This provides less to create a fullness to the brew because there are fewer flavorful molecules remaining to stimulate the tongue. As a result, most people prefer a medium roast as it gives the fullest body to the brew. After being roasted, coffee beans will keep well for a few weeks at room temperature or a few months in the freezer. They'll keep relatively well because those holes in the spongy bean are filled with carbon dioxide, which keeps oxygen from the air out of those holes. However, once the beans are ground, that carbon dioxide is released and oxygen from the air has access to the entire bean. As a result, the grounds will stale in a few days. So the best flavor of the brew will result if you buy whole roasted beans and then grind the beans yourself. However, the extra work and expense of grinding the beans means that many simply purchase pre-ground beans. We've talked about the brewing process, but let's delve a little deeper into the chemistry involved in producing a brew exactly as you might prefer. In order to brew the coffee, we need to extract the desirable flavorful molecules from the bean into the water, ideally without extracting too many of the undesirable flavorful molecules along with them. That is, we need to carefully control the extraction process to provide amounts and ratios of the flavorful molecules that provide a well-balanced, pleasing drink. Too much or too little extraction can cause an imbalanced, subpar drink. The compounds extracted from the grounds into the brew consist of roughly 1/3 browning pigments that provide the color and the flavor, roughly 1/3 carbohydrates that provide body, and roughly 1/3 other compounds. The flavor, color, and body of the brewed drink will be affected by a variety of factors, including how finely ground the beans are, the ratio of grounds to water, and the percentage of the beans extracted into the water. If we have inadequate extraction, we'll end up with a watery, acidic brew. This could be the result of a variety of different factors. First is grinding the beans too coarsely. That is, if we have large particles of ground bean, the water can't get to the molecules in the interior of the particle, so those molecules can't dissolve in the water. Second could be too brief of contact between grounds and water. That is, we didn't allow enough time for enough flavorful molecules to dissolve into the water. And third is that the brew occurred at too low a temperature, reducing the solubility of the flavorful molecules in the water. A low temperature would also slow down the extraction process, so an even longer time would be needed. On the other hand, if we over-extract flavorful compounds from the beans, we'll end up with a harsh, bitter brew. If we grind the grounds too finely, then too high a fraction of the bean will be extracted. Likewise, if we allow the extraction to occur for too long, we'll extract too many flavorful compounds. And finally, if we allow the temperature of the water to get too high, we'll increase the extraction of the bitter compounds. So we have to balance the size of the grounds, the length of brewing time, and the brewing temperature. For any style of coffee, the ideal brewing temperature is between 190 and 200 degrees Fahrenheit. Note that this is lower than the 212 degrees Fahrenheit that water boils at, so any coffee maker that boils the water will over-extract the grounds and will tend towards a more bitter brew. For the typical American coffee, the brewing time is 1 to 3 minutes for finely ground beans, or 6 to 8 minutes for coarsely ground beans. As we've seen, there are a variety of different brewing methods. Most of them extract between 20 and 25% of the weight of the bean. This provides a drink that contains 1.3 to about 5.5% extract from the bean, with the remainder being the water that was used to extract that flavor. The proportion of coffee grounds to water is 1 to 15 for American coffee or 1 to 5 for espresso. Note, however, that it's always best to err on the side of too many grounds. While you might end up with a brew that's stronger than you prefer, you could simply add additional water to dilute the brew. However, if you err on the side of too few grounds, you can't remove the extra water. You'll have to throw it out and brew some more. Each of the brewing methods has its advantages and drawbacks. Percolators operate above the boiling point of water and thus tend to over-extract, which produces a bitter, harsh brew. Automatic drip brewers often don't get quite hot enough to extract quickly, and so they compensate by brewing for a longer time period. This produces a brew with some bitterness, and some aroma is also then lost to the air. A manual drip cone gives little control over the extraction time. And again, a plunger pot leaves tiny suspended particles of coffee grounds in the brew that continue to release bitter compounds similar to what we saw with the Arabian-style brew. A stovetop mocha pot operates at a very high temperature of 230 degrees Fahrenheit, which produces a harsh brew. We can also use an overnight extraction using cold water instead of hot. However, the cold water doesn't extract as many aromatic molecules as compared to the hot water techniques. Let's now turn to espresso. A true espresso is made quite quickly in about 30 seconds by forcing water through the grounds at a very high pressure of around 9 atmospheres and moderately high temperatures of about 200 degrees Fahrenheit. The proportion of coffee to water is about 3 or 4 times higher than in the other brewing techniques, so the resulting brew is about 3 to 4 times stronger. The combination of high pressure and high coffee concentration gives espresso a strong taste and substantial body. That high pressure extracts a large concentration of oils from the bean, and those oils then emulsify into tiny droplets suspended in the water. Like we saw with the capsaicin oil from chilies, those oil droplets don't easily leave the mouth, so they continue to release coffee flavors in the mouth even after swallowing the drink. Those oils extracted from the bean also cause espresso to have a very stable, creamy foam on the surface. This foam is the result of the carbon dioxide trapped in the spongy grounds dissolving at high pressure. Then, when the pressure is reduced as the espresso leaves the machine, the carbon dioxide leaves the water and produces the foam. So once the coffee is brewed, how exactly should it be stored? Ideally, the coffee should be served immediately. The ideal drinking temperature is about 140 degrees Fahrenheit. This is low enough that a sip won't scald the mouth, but high enough for the aromatic compounds to vaporize and provide the coffee's aroma. Note that as we pour the coffee into a room temperature cup, the coffee will cool. So we keep the coffee in the pot at a temperature just below the brewing temperature rather than allowing it to cool all the way down to 140 degrees Fahrenheit. However, this high temperature encourages further chemical reactions. It also causes the volatile aromatic compounds to escape the liquid and enter the air. The combination of these two effects means that the flavor will change significantly in less than an hour of sitting in the pot as the coffee becomes more acidic and less aromatic, although it will make the room smell good if you enjoy the aroma of coffee. So the best way to keep the coffee hot is in a preheated, insulated, and closed container, such as the carafe on the left. In the typical open coffee pot used by many restaurants, the volatile chemicals escape from the top. Furthermore, because it's not insulated, it needs to be continuously heated, which tends to burn the coffee at the bottom surface of the pot. Now, we've discussed the effects of caffeine on the body, and some people enjoy drinking coffee but prefer to avoid consuming that caffeine. For these people, we produce decaffeinated coffee. The decaffeination process involves soaking the beans in water to dissolve the caffeine. Then, a solvent such as methylene chloride or ethyl acetate is used to extract the caffeine from the water. This works because the caffeine is more soluble in the solvent than it is in the water. However, caffeine isn't the only compound more soluble in these solvents than in water, and so some of the flavorful and aromatic compounds will be lost as well. The beans are then steamed to remove any remaining solvent. Now, we can't remove all of the remaining solvent, and there have been some concerns about the health effects of the small amount of residual solvent left on or in the beans. Current research indicates that while methylene chloride is toxic at high concentrations, it's safe at the low concentrations found in these decaffeinated beans. However, we have seen some increased usage of other decaffeination techniques that avoid using these toxic solvents. One of these is using only water as the solvent and then filtering the caffeine from the water using activated charcoal before adding back the remaining water-soluble compounds into the beans. Another technique is using supercritical carbon dioxide to dissolve the caffeine. Supercritical carbon dioxide is carbon dioxide at high temperature and pressure, such that the difference between the liquid and the gas phases disappears. At these high pressures, the carbon dioxide acts as a solvent to dissolve the caffeine. When the beans are returned to normal atmospheric pressure, the carbon dioxide is easily removed. Furthermore, there already was carbon dioxide in the beans from the roasting process. Any remaining carbon dioxide is present at low enough concentrations that it poses no health risk, especially since we produce carbon dioxide ourselves, and so we have very robust mechanisms for removing it from our bodies. Whichever process is used, however, not all of the caffeine is removed. Where an ordinary cup of coffee contains between 60 and 180 milligrams of caffeine, a cup of decaf contains between 2 and 5 milligrams. So the vast majority of the caffeine is removed, but there is still some present, as there's a balance between removing more caffeine and removing too many of the other flavorful and aromatic compounds. Yet another modern type of coffee is instant coffee. Instant coffee is essentially freeze-dried coffee. That is, the flavor, color, and aroma compounds are extracted from the beans into water as normal, and then the brewed coffee is dried to remove most of the water. However, the freeze-drying process that removes the water also tends to remove many of the aromatic compounds since they're more volatile than the water. This means that the rehydrated instant coffee is missing a significant component, and most coffee drinkers prefer freshly brewed coffee. Now, many people add milk or cream to their coffee to improve the taste. But what is it about milk and cream that makes them the go-to liquid to add? The milk proteins bind to the phenolic compounds in the coffee to reduce the astringency, making the drinking experience more pleasant. However, those same proteins also bind to some of the aromatic molecules and weaken the overall coffee flavor. So each drinker will have their own preferred ratio of coffee to milk or cream to produce a mixture that they enjoy best. Now remember from a previous video that fermented milk products can separate into the semi-solid curds and watery whey. This occurs because there are dozens of different proteins in the milk, but there are only two types of proteins. Casein proteins coagulate upon being acidified and heated to form the curds. And whey proteins do not clump together upon being heated, and so they remain suspended in the liquid. But if we haven't acidified the milk, both the casein and whey proteins tolerate heat quite well. That is, we can heat the fresh, non-fermented milk without curdling it. This allows us to heat the milk to pasteurize it to kill any bacteria present without altering the milk taste significantly. It also allows us to boil the milk and cream to a small fraction of their volume without curdling as long as they're not acidic. That is, we can produce products like evaporated milk by removing much of the water, or even produce powdered milk by removing virtually all of the water without significantly impacting the taste. Again though, if we acidify the milk, those casein proteins begin to curdle and give us the thick, cultured milk products such as yogurt and cheese. Now, while the whey proteins don't coagulate into curds, they do influence the texture of those curdled casein proteins. And the casein proteins typically are significantly more abundant than the whey proteins at a ratio of roughly 4:1. Now, we'll discuss cheese in greater detail in an upcoming video.